Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome on this kind of slightly steamy day out there. Glad to have you with us. This is this month's installment of our Life Science Lunch program, and in conjunction with our dear friends here at Barnes Thornburg, we want to welcome you to the program today. We have a lovely panel all set and ready to go and eager to get started. I just have a couple of housekeeping items real quick. If you're not familiar with the Indiana Health Industry Forum, we are the trade association for the life science industry here in the state. We work with everything from biopharma companies, medical devices, health IT, service providers across the broad spectrum, education, and even now and then some of those wacky folks in healthcare delivery. So we are a broad umbrella, but we are the place where the life sciences all comes together here in the state. We are very pleased to be able to present programs like this and hope you will continue to join us throughout the year as we sort out our schedule and try to get a couple more of these lined up. We will not be here next month. We will be participating, both Barnes Thornburg and IHIF participate in the BIO Convention, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization's annual event. So we're going to take June off, but we will be back in July. So you can mark your calendars for the third Tuesday in there. If you're interested in more information on IHIF and the constituencies we serve and the services we offer, there's some information in your programs, handy dandy, or you can visit us online at ihif.org, not to be confused with IHI and or any of those other acronyms that are floating around out there in the industry. So thank you all very much. Enjoy your lunches. I'm going to turn it over now to Deborah Pollack-Milgate with Barnes Thornburg to introduce the panel and get us started today. Deborah?
Thank you, Kristin, and good afternoon, everybody. We have an exciting program in store for you today. I will say we often have 3 or 4 panelists, but I assure you we probably couldn't take a third today with all of the information that the two of them have to impart on the subject of GDPR. So you're lucky we only have 2 panelists today to cover this territory. Both are here, and you will see, for a very specific reason. I haven't met anyone, I think, who has more knowledge, in-depth knowledge of the GDPR and what we all need to know about this regulation. So I'm going to start off with just a brief introduction here. Brian McGinnis, who is immediately to my left, your right, he's a partner here at Barnes Thornburg. And he's a founding member of the firm's data security and privacy law practice group. He's also a member of the intellectual property department and the internet and technology practice. He has earned what's called a certified information privacy professional certification from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which is the leading certification for privacy professionals around the world. And he regularly works with clients to develop risk-based approaches to managing data privacy and cybersecurity legal obligations. In connection with the GDPR specifically, he has considerable experience assisting clients in assessing their obligations under the GDPR. He works with cross-organizational teams and advises clients toward a clear understanding of the applicability of GDPR to their business practices. He assists in auditing personal data collection and use and helps clients develop and implement the strategies necessary to meet their GDPR compliance obligations. And I will tell you on a personal note, I don't know if this is actually all that personal, but Brian was much more concerned about these regulations than any of us. Most of us wanted to stick our heads in the sand, and instead he stuck his head in the regulation and read it cover to cover. So we thank you for that, Brian. Next to Brian, we have Kristin Eilenberg, and Kristin Eilenberg is the CEO of Lodestone Logic. She founded the organization in 2010 as a global consultancy. Lodestone helps organizations develop strategies and action plans, recognizing the influences of regulations, protocols, market economics, and business opportunities. Lodestone has been involved with the work to create policies such as the EU's General Data Protection Regulation. Did you catch? I got the acronym there for you. General Data Protection Regulation, and the U.S.'s 21st Century Cures Act. So Kristin's going to have a lot to say today about the actual negotiation of the regulation. Ms. Eilenberg has authored several scientific publications and the book Business Intrapreneurs, which is a very nice title, Unsung Heroes of Corporate America, and she has her International Masters of Business Administration from Purdue University and a double Bachelor's of Science in Medical Microbiology and Environmental Science and Management from Michigan State University. And I believe some of you probably know Kristin. She also had a very long and distinguished career at Lilly in a number of different roles for what, about a decade? 14 years, okay. So welcome, Kristin and Brian. As we were as we were preparing for today's meeting, one of our questions was really, what is the skill set, what is the knowledge base of the audience going to be? And so if you'll bear with us, we'd like to just ask you a few questions preliminarily to get a sense of where you are with your knowledge on the GDPR. So how many, well, I'll start easy, right? How many of you have heard of the GDPR before today? Okay, so far so good. How many can actually say what the acronym stands for? Before today.
In the right order, too. GDRD more times than I care.
Yeah, I prefer GDRP myself. Okay, how many of you have taken steps to become GDPR compliant? Okay, and how many of you have taken extensive steps, would you say, to become GDPR compliant? Okay, a few. And so last question, how many of you are absolutely satisfied that you've done everything you need to do in advance of this May 25th deadline? Okay, no one. So I think they came to the right place, right? Okay. So what we're going to do today to set the stage, and I think this is really based on at least our understanding, our experience, that the knowledge base with respect to the GDPR is perhaps not as vast as it should be. We'd like to start out with just a couple of presentations that hopefully will lay out some of the basics for you, if there is any such thing. So with that, Brian, dig right in.
So thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for taking the time to spend a few minutes with us today. So the general notion here is to run through and introduce some of these concepts, both to, I guess, sort of as an overview for those of you lucky enough not to be spending your entire lives delving into this European regulation like I am right now, but also to highlight some of the concepts that Kristin wants to really dig into that pertain most, I would say, to this industry and some of the problems that she's seeing in terms of companies that are within the industry. How are they working through this? And that, to us, I think, is the more interesting conversation than the nuts and bolts of this thing. So we'll cruise through this and then get to that conversation, but wanted to set the stage here with what this thing is and what the heck we're talking about here. So as Deborah went through GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, what we're doing here is we're replacing the EU Data Protection Directive that came out in 1995. A little thing called the Internet has sort of come to roost within that time period. And so GDPR was largely based at let's update the regulation to something that's a little bit more modern and takes into account modern day data collection practices and also plugs a lot of the holes that have been exposed as part of that regulation. Massive change, easily the biggest change in 20 plus years here. It was actually introduced sometime in 2012. Kristin and I were just talking about some of her involvement in those intervening 6 years in terms of what this ended up looking like. It finally got approved in 2016. And we are ramping up to this May 25th deadline that cannot get here soon enough. From my perspective, probably too soon for most everybody else working on projects. But I guess the effective date for enforcement of this regulation is just a couple weeks' time from now. So what is this thing? It regulates the quote-unquote processing of the quote-unquote personal data of EU residents or EU individuals, and we'll dig into those terms a little bit more in a moment. Major differences compared to U.S. law. This is really an apples and oranges situation when it comes to what is generally considered a lax and lower standard U.S. Legal scheme for general data protection and privacy laws and regulations versus what they have, which is creating obviously some big challenges for companies around the world, whether you're EU or not, and certainly for a lot of US companies. What's the big deal? Why do we care? Underestimated impact by far. We're just talking through the number of companies that are just starting on this or just hearing about it is a bit scary, and that's honestly not only true here in the US, but also in the EU. Companies are generally really far behind the process in terms of getting up to speed on what this means. Fundamentally different ideals than what we're currently dealing with. This will change. I don't care what business you're in. This regulation will change the way that you do business if you have or use or have access to or want to see any information about people, period. This will change it. And I challenge anyone here to be able to operate a business without being able to do that these days. It's a different legal system. It's a totally different approach to what we take here. And oh, by the way, they put some teeth into this thing. I always try to make this number nice and big, but the one that you see thrown around most often is there's enforcement capability in here to levy fines up to 4% of the annual global revenue of your organization. 4%, it's more than a speeding ticket. Oh, and by the way, this thing has massive reach, and so there's some questions about, okay, if I get a judgment against me in Europe, how are they going to enforce it here? Well, not within the purview of today to dig into that. But again, for most organizations that are handling any data, handling information about people, want to do business on a global scale or even multinational scale of any scope, it will be extremely difficult not to pay attention to what is happening with GDPR, certainly from the perspective of your own business, but those that you want to work with as clients or customers or service providers and the like. We're already seeing this thing really get pushed down through the larger multinational organizations into the smaller companies, and that's only going to continue to increase and change. So GDPR applies when? It applies to any organization that processes this personal data, whether or not they're based in the EU countries. So that's a key point here as well. Certainly if you have a physical location or EU presence, you've got people there, you've got a facility there, absolutely it's going to apply. But what a lot of people are missing on is that the scope of this thing tracks the data of Europeans no matter where they are, really, and certainly into the U.S. And so if you are offering goods and services into the EU from the U.S., you want to collect that information about those people, or you've got a clinical trial that involves Europeans, the regulation is going to attach to their information. If you're monitoring EU data subjects' behavior, so think of a marketing context or name a favorite marketing company. Cambridge Analytica is getting beat up plenty right now. Facebook, those kind of companies that are doing those behind-the-scenes collection and processing activities of people's information. And you'll see in a moment that definition of personal data of people's information is extremely broad. The regulation is going to apply to them as well. So to get into those definitions, personal data. Here in the U.S., we typically use personal information, PII, personally identifiable information. I assume all of you are probably familiar with PHI. Protected health information under HIPAA. It's all of those things plus more. So personal data includes all of that stuff, but also think to the granular level of IP addresses, photographs, people's names, email addresses, all these different location data, online identifiers, et cetera, et cetera. The definition of what is personal data and therefore what is considered within the scope of this relation is any, underscore any, information about an identified or identifiable individual. So in the IP address context, technically, an individual that you have no relationship with comes to your website one time, you're running the most vanilla version of Google Analytics against it, and you're collecting that individual's IP address. You've now just processed the personal data of an EU individual. You're now within scope of GDPR. How we handle that, we can go into in another conversation, but just to show you the breadth of this thing. Within that definition of personal data, the regulators said, okay, we need to consider other things basically at a higher level, what they call special categories of data. So certainly things like genetic data, biometric data, those kinds of things that we would all, I think, assume are sort of a higher level sensitivity than somebody's email address or IP address that you can get anywhere. They put within the special categories distinction, which requires some additional steps to be able to process that information. Some things that I'm seeing a lot of companies and clients miss on, though, are basic things like if you're running, like, I don't know, demographics about members to your organization, you ask them racial or ethnic origin or about employees or something like that. All those are also considered special categories. Whether or not you're in a trade union is a special category. Those types of things are also wrapped up within this. And you need to take some additional steps to be able to get their consent to process that information. So this term processing. Honestly, the way I've come to think of this is anything that any of us in this room are smart enough to think of doing with data, from storing it, transferring it, moving it around, even viewing it, even the ability to see that data. If you're in the US and you've got data that has always lived in Europe on a European server, but your people here in the US have the ability to access that or see that, even that is quote unquote processing. And if that information is being processed about personal data, again, GDPR is in scope. You're going to have to think through this with this, what the implications are for the business. Really quickly, because I'm sure this will come up in some context, but GDPR divides the world mostly into data controllers and data processors. Data controllers are those entities that essentially own the relationship with the individual and certainly with the data. They're the ones in charge. They determine what gets collected, what happens to it, who are we going to send it to. Whereas the processors are the people that are downline from them. And so one of the big changes of GDPR that filled a bit of a gap with the data directive was explicitly requiring the data processor, so those downline third parties in some cases, to also be compliant with the regulation. So if I'm a controller, I collect it in, I own the relationship with the individual and then directing the collection. Everybody that I send it to beyond me becomes a data processor. They also have their own vendors and service providers. Those are sub-processors. One of the key things that companies need to get in place, and they need to do it, frankly, now, are what are called data processor or data processing agreements, where the controller is responsible to have in place a contract, an agreement with each of its data processors that lays out the requirements of GDPR, makes disclosures to individuals, a whole host of requirements. But getting those in place for companies, those controller processor agreements, is one of the first and key and most urgent activities under these GDPR projects right now. And with the rest of these, we'll just dig in on some of the highlights of what this thing requires once we've got the definitions under us. One big thing that I don't think will come up as much in context here, but did want to highlight, you're not allowed to do anything with this European personal data unless and until you've identified a lawful basis to do so. There are 6 of those. We've laid those out here. Performance of a contract, pursuant to a legal obligation, there's some kind of public interest, et cetera, et cetera. But the 2 that you see most companies dealing with are consent, which we'll go into a little bit more, and then something called the legitimate interest provision that frankly a lot of companies are using as a, I don't want to get consent, so what else can I use kind of a provision, and then they try and find a way to squeeze within that. Legitimate interest is balancing act between you as a company or an organization's desire to collect this information from this individual and the individual's, per EU regulation, fundamental human right to protect their data and prevent people from doing things they don't want to do with it. So it can be a pretty tricky, obviously, balancing test between those often competing interests, but there are ways that you can process people's information under GDPR without obtaining their explicit consent to do so. There's a bit of a misconception that you have to have consent in all cases. You do not. You certainly can get it, but there are some alternatives. If you do get consent, this whole world that we operate under here in the US of implied consent, pre-check boxes, Facebook can do whatever they want about you because they've got a privacy policy up on their website somewhere that nobody's ever read, are gone under GDPR. It has to be freely given, specific, so no, we can collect whatever we want and do whatever we want with it. It needs to be specifically tied to certain actions that you're taking. Certainly informed and unambiguous consent from the individual to qualify as sufficient under GDPR. When you're talking about those special categories, it must be explicit, which is even higher bar. No more implied consent. I say think EU cookie directive. We're all familiar with those pop-ups that say, you know, you go to a European website, we collect cookies, is that okay? That's a different law, commonly referred to as the EU cookie law. The technical name is the e-privacy directive, which is also being revamped, but you heard it here first. That's the next one we'll be up here on the panel talking about when that one comes out here in a couple of years, I think. But anyway, you're going to start seeing more and more of those notices that are not only going to be tied to cookie collection, but also really any kind of personal data collection. And also, one of the big problems with consent is not only does it have to have a higher standard to get in, to get that consent, it also has to be as easy to withdraw that consent as it was to give it. So if you've got a scenario set up where individuals are checking a box to get into it, you can't make them, you know, send in proof of purchase and, you know, 2 mules to get off of your mailing list or something like that. It has to be an easy way to get in and an easy way to get out, which frankly is a technical challenge for a lot of companies who aren't as sophisticated with the way that they manage data. Some other key provisions here to wrap up. Right to be forgotten data portability is within that. So a lot of us are familiar with this right to be forgotten from a Google case that said, you know, if I contact you and I want you to, like, I don't know, wipe my arrest record from Google searches, that's a different law. That's something different. Under right to be forgotten under GDPR, also right to erasure. I have the ability as an individual, GDPR provides a lot of rights to what they call data subjects, to contact organizations that have information about me and direct them to take certain action. One of those is to erase the data that you have about me. The problems that come in there for a lot of companies are, again, identifying what information you have about an individual and doing that across your organization. So are you prepared today if somebody comes to you and says, I want you to delete every single piece of information that you have about me, and I want it gone right away? Most organizations, some organizations can do that with no problem, but a lot of organizations struggle because they have different pockets of information that came from different places all over the place. No connection internally to know who has what or where it came from. Obviously, a bad scenario is somebody comes in, requests deletion, you tell them that their information is deleted. 2 weeks later, they're getting a bunch of additional contacts or processing from you. And how to avoid those situations can be really tricky. There's restrictions on further processing. So we talked through some of this with this controller processor. If you're going to collect this information, there comes with that a responsibility to comply with this regulation. Included amongst that is controlling what happens to it after it leaves you. When you send it off to other folks, you are essentially in the controller role now responsible for that further processing. Individuals have the right to object to certain types of data collection, including, and this might come into context in this industry, decisions that are made on an automated basis. So if you're collecting I always use a car insurance scenario. Car insurance companies these days love to hook up devices to everybody's car to help service you better, and oh, by the way, collect every piece of data that we can about how fast you drive, how many times you get in an accident, do you stop at stop signs, all this kind of stuff. If they're making decisions, let's say, on your insurance rates based on the data that they collect off of that only, that's an automated decision, arguably, and you have the right to object to some of those kinds of processing. Data protection officers. Has anyone named a data protection officer at this point? So this is a new, unique thing. We got one. To GDPR that requires for companies that are involved in the regular and systematic processing of personal data of EU individuals, which is a lot more companies than it would sound like. They have to appoint somebody specifically within the organization to serve not as like a chief privacy officer, but as a data protection officer whose job and role is to essentially, I think of it like as a ombudsman at a newspaper. They review what's going on with the organization. They're part of decision making for any decisions or any actions that get taken by a company that have to do with personal data and processing of that personal data. And they have to report to the highest C level of the organization, direct reporting lines there to be able to report on the activity of the organization. A lot of companies are looking for ways around having to appoint these at this point, or attaching that title to somebody else that works there, but I expect as we go forward, you're going to see more and more people serving in this role in a more genuine way. One of the key things was to make this a one-stop shop. We don't need to go into that today in terms of, I guess, homogenizing some of the regulation that existed on an individual member state previously under the directive. All that is now within GDPR. Very high level of data breach notification requirements, including a requirement that if there is a breach, you have to report it to the supervisory authority within 72 hours in some cases. Here in the US, we're generally working off a 30-day timeline when we're talking about a security breach. Heavy enforcement, massive fines, we went through that, and extremely broad reach. So just some of the fun that GDPR brings along with us. With that, let's dig in a little bit more here on the life sciences implications and turn it over to Kristin.
And I'll add here too, obviously that we have a lot of content today, and so I don't know how many questions we'll get to from the audience, but you do have cards on the table, and so if you do have a question and want to jot it down, someone will come around and bring those up to me so that we can get to as many as we can.
So hello everybody, I'm Kristin, and I'm going to give you some perspectives on how GDPR is going to impact the life sciences industry. Brian's already identified some of the key elements. What I'm going to do is highlight several of them that are specific to some of the things that you guys are dealing with. So health data and clinical data was identified as a special category. As Brian was saying, it was realized that there's a higher sensitivity about these particular data items and that it needed to be classified separate and also managed separately. During the conversations 4 or 5 years ago, what we realized was because it wasn't classified in a special way, that healthcare data would be treated just like they were trying to enforce and create laws to hinder some of the uses that Facebook and Google were doing over in European countries. And so there was a big concern that if they applied the general framework to healthcare data and to clinical data, then it would literally stop our ability to innovate. And from a scientific standpoint, it was a huge concern. And so I was involved with a lot of the early stage conversations to try to get healthcare data and clinical data recognized as this special category so that it could be subsetted and managed in a very different way. Some of the things, Brian identified that explicit consent is necessary for the use of health data and clinical data. So for the folks who know ICH guidelines, it's really no different. However, there's going to be some new sections to the consents that need to be written and put into the standard templates for the consents that our clinical trial participants are going to have to sign off on. It includes a new, and I'm putting new in air quotes here because it's been around now for a few years, pseudo-anonymization. And how many people actually know what this means? Okay, so, well, we got one. Okay, so pseudo-anonymization. So when you think of your participation in clinical trials, a lot of people thought that their data was anonymized. Okay, so they think that when they participate, they can't be found out that it was Kristin Eilenberg that participated in clinical trial. What we realized was that really wasn't the case with clinical trial data, because we can always go back and re-identify the data. And yet, we don't want to. As an industry, we prefer to have that double blind in place so that we don't know who's actually participating in our clinical trials because we don't want it to influence our analytics and statistical plans. So pseudonymization is the process through which data is re-identified because you actually do know how to get in touch with these people, but you don't want to do it. So there's language in there around you're not anonymized. We can ultimately figure out who you are because we have the relationships with your clinicians and those kinds of things. But we're pseudo-anonymizing the data so much so that we're able to do the statistical analysis. So I don't know if you recall, and actually you can go back in your books, some of the slides that Brian presented on what are the types of attributes of the data that's covered in GDPR. Many of those things are attributes that we still pull into our clinical trial data sets. So that's why we have to pseudo-anonymize. The special uses, and this is going to be, it'll be really interesting. Brian and I were talking about this before the event. It's going to be very interesting to see the risk curve on some of the organizations and how they manage this, because I think that there's going to be organizations that are going to explicitly identify the data analytics that they're going to put the data through in the consent for their clinical trial participants, and then there's others that are still going to be vague so that they have a level of freedom to be able to still do whatever they want. So I think that we're going to see a very broad spectrum of how that particular element is embedded into the consents. Transmissions, processing, and integrations of the data. So this is the movement of the data. I don't know how many remember clinical trials back in the 90s, but I remember when we would have to send a statistical team over to Germany to do the analysis of the German clinical trial patient data because it wasn't allowed to come over here. So in some cases, I think that we are going to start to see, and there is already, Germany and France are already starting to do this, hunkering down and closing the borders and saying, okay, if you're going to analyze the patient data, it can't come over. So we're going to have to see how that actually evolves and what level of control is put into place by different member states. And then the one thing that has, if you look and you read on GDPR and life sciences, a lot of people are missing, but you need to think about this. GDPR still has that we have to put into our consents the requirement for data exploration. So what that means, and I don't know how this is really going to roll out, quite honestly, is that when you do a clinical trial, you're going to have to communicate to that patient that their data will expire at some point in time. If you think of patent protection, you think of commercial opportunities, you think of all those kinds of things, at some point in time there's going to be erasure of clinical trial data. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing. It's kind of scary for me, but it's something that has to be embedded in the consents that we're going to redo. Now, the right to be forgotten. So the story behind the right to be forgotten was a gentleman with Spanish descent. He wanted to go buy a house And because of the internet, that lovely thing that we all love to hate, there was information about a bar fight that he had 10 years prior, and he couldn't get a mortgage. And he wanted his right to be forgotten because he wanted to go buy a house without other people knowing that his past, because it was 10 years ago, for Pete's sakes, right? Like, that's not who he is right now. So the irony is that he went and he did a lawsuit, and now it's globally known why he went and got the lawsuit, to be the right to be forgotten, but he's really not forgotten now. We all know who he is. We all know what's going on. But the thing, because we were able to categorize clinical trial data as a special category, the right to be forgotten does not apply to clinical trial data. So in the conversations that we had, what we realized was if we, and back in my clinical trial days, if we break the glass for every single request of somebody who wants to be forgotten because they participated in a clinical trial, we're unblinding study after study after study after study. And it really would create a significant issue with regards to scientific process, scientific evaluation, those kinds of things, as well as ongoing readjustments of label claims, understanding of what's really going on with the disease etiologies, because you'd be changing your population stats and all those kinds of things. So we negotiated that if we had to pursue the right to be forgotten in clinical research, it would do more harm. But the consent language needs to include language where that person waives their right to be forgotten. So again, it's another part of the consent that needs to be put in there that they explicitly sign off that they waive their right to be forgotten. And as always, participants can leave a study at any point in time, but because they've waived their right to be forgotten, any of the existing data that's on file about them stays with the study. It's just that from that point on, there's no observational points of data. Okay? So what do I think is going to happen when it comes to our industry and clinical research? I think it's going to be phenomenal. I'm a data geek, and I've worked on a lot of major data projects and those kinds of things. And a lot of times when we get our hands on databases, nobody knows why the database was created from the get-go. They don't understand what was the initial business value for creating the database. They don't understand why what standards were being used for the database and how that database potentially could connect with other databases. I think it's going to increase individual business stewardship and inventory management of databases as true assets for the business, which I think is going to be phenomenal. The change for GDPR, even though it's a European regulation, for most businesses, in fact, I was talking to some folks at Allison Transmissions, they're doing a global stuff because when it comes to their data, they don't know if you're a European citizen, they don't know if you're a European citizen, they don't know if I'm a US citizen. So they'd rather just say, you know what, we're doing this, we're all in, we know we're an American company, but we've got to do what we've got to do to maintain our compliance, because we don't want to put 4% of our global revenue at risk, period. So what we're going to see is, even though we're in America, this is not an American policy, it will be implemented by major organizations as if it is, or as are. I don't know what the proper English is for that. The challenge, again, on the data that's already out there, if we intend to use it for scientific purposes, it does need to be reconsented by all these things that I've already identified. And so the processes to move forward in getting everybody reconsented so that the use of the data is clearly defined and people understand their rights is going to take time. And if we think about all the databases, at least when I think of my time at Lilly, that we've procured and purchased over the years, significant amounts of money invested towards these types of assets. We've got to think through from a risk-benefit standpoint, can we continue to use this data to justify our understanding of diseases and etiologies and the claims that we want to put forth with our products? And I think every single business is going to have to figure out their risk profile on use of existing data versus shifting everything up, getting all new, clean, perfectly consented data and the whole entire thing, and what is their boundaries of getting all those things in place. And so the costs for administration to be compliant are going to be very high for many organizations, and they will have to go back and reconsent all active clinical trial participants, especially start off with the European ones and then come over to the US. what scares me about this, and if you haven't picked up on it, is access to data. I mean, I believe in the whole thing of open data, freedom of data, all of these different kinds of things, and I think that this is going to restrict access and use of data that we previously thought we could use for scientific purposes, and it may give us some hiccups. It may delay things and truly slow our progress towards precision medicine, because it's going to take us some time to figure out what data we can use, what data we can't use, and then what do we have to do in between. And it may really have us lose opportunities towards scientific innovation and understanding how our products are going to impact the population of this earth. So I think that's my last slide there.
Always
So-
a cheerful
Yeah,
conversation.
right? I have no idea what to say. Does everybody's head hurt yet? So, Kristin, you hinted at this already, that you, and I mentioned it as well, that you were actually in the room while portions of the GDPR were negotiated. How did that come about? Can you share your experience with us?
Yeah, so there was already movement towards some kind of privacy policy that needed to be put into place. And a lot of it has to do with the Europeans' fear of Google and Facebook. And then also at that time there was some significant breaches with mobile phone systems. So Europeans being here in the United States, being monitored while they were on vacation in Florida, and it's a recognized kind of thing. There was a whole bunch of different things that were going on. And there was some few key stakeholders that said, if we don't get a seat at the table, then health data and clinical trial data is not going to be created as a special category. So we've got to do something. And I had just started Lodestone Logic, and I had already done several projects. I had worked on HL7 standards, those kinds of things. And they called me up and they said, we want to try to figure out how to get stakeholders pulled together to start to have this kind of conversation, better understand what are the types of pillars that are most important for us to pursue. And basically we had, and I was telling this to Brian, we had multiple meetings with different stakeholders. And as we were having those meetings, European Parliament wanted to get involved. The WHO was very much wanting to get involved. Something I learned in the process was that there are many nation states around the world that don't have regulatory bodies like Europe and like the United States, and so they just adopt policies once they're put into place. And so the other thing that we realized that in Europe, a lot of Europeans' governance is just adopted by the world. So whatever Europe does, it's not just in Europe, it's also across the globe. And that's the other thing you need to realize. If you do business in Europe, it could also be if you're doing business in Saudi Arabia, it could be that you're doing business down in South America or in Africa. They just adopt the policies. So it's going to have broader implications, and we felt like we needed to pull together the stakeholders to have the conversation around health data and how it should be categorized.
And so other than the, obviously the incentive we know, which is privacy and data protection, were there other impetuses behind this regulation that you came to realize as you participated in the process? So
one of the things that was quite surprising was we've had conversations around the lack of the workforce to support appropriate use of data. So informatics professionals and professionals that did data analysis and those kinds of things, because they're not, you can train, and I think you see more and more schools, including the IU School of Informatics here in Indianapolis, is trying to prepare individuals on how do you use data with the correct purpose or an understood purpose and controls, because you can't just go in, and I don't know how many of you are hard scientists, but I love scientific method, right? Like you have your hypothesis, you figure out your materials, you put together all of those kinds of things. And if you see somebody just jump into a data set and start mucking around in there and trying to do analysis without a hypothesis, of course they're going to come up with something, right? Because it was an uncontrolled, in my mind, analysis. And so what we wanted to do is make sure that also as part of it, there is focus on what does that workforce need to look like. So there's a gap in informatics training. how does the WHO get involved in making sure that we have the informatics professionals there that know how to collect data, clean data, organize data, and then actually do the analysis of it. It was a surprise. I didn't even expect that.
And so as you worked through the negotiation, was there a particular regulation, portion of the regulation language that you wanted to get but that you didn't? I mean, where we've seen
there was a lot of iterations. There was a lot of iterations.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you start off with, there's even been changes since my direct involvement, because that's what happens when you get to the politicians, like the true politicians that are putting down the law. But our key mission and focus was to get healthcare data and clinical trial data identified as a special category, so that it did not fall under the stuff that they wanted to put on Facebook and Google and the major marketing types of uses.
Okay, so you succeeded on that. That was
Yes,
the driving
that was like
purpose,
that was the
obviously.
checkbox.
Check.
That was the checkbox. It took 3 years. Like, we were involved in multiple stakeholder conversations, white papers. I spent a bit of time in Brussels. You know, it is what it is. You just do what you got to do.
Yeah. So turning to you, Brian, and really also because we've overwhelmed our audience a little bit with all of the things to think about. Can you provide some advice let's break it down, some advice to those who are concerned about GDPR, how they quickly put together a framework for becoming GDPR compliant? What should they really be focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, get started. So you hear a lot about this May 25th deadline. We are past May 25th at this point. You're not going to get this done by then. What this requires is a rethinking of your organization, how they handle data. And honestly, starting by taking that seriously and thinking through that, understanding, which most organizations are frankly not good at all at, is understanding where that data comes into the organization. Who is collecting information? Where does it come from? What is the process by which we are collecting it? You mentioned some data sets that have huge value that you got from somebody else. Well, where did they get it from? I get that they have a really valuable database. Did they have the rights to put it in there? Further, do they have the rights to now lease it or sell it to us? And now GDPR comes on top of that. What are the consents? Did they get any consent at the outset to have that? If they did, is that GDPR level consent, or now do we have to reassess that data and get a new consent flow going so that we can be sure that it's clean data going forward, et cetera, et cetera. But really starting at the standpoint of understanding what you have, data audit, data mapping, whatever you want to call it. Get that all out on the table in front of you and truly understand what data exists within your organization. You have to do that before we can do anything else. Put it all out on the table, and then from there we can start figuring out, okay, where are we good, where are we bad, where are the holes, where are the gaps with our current compliance based on what we're doing in the U.S. That really starts with it. The other thing is getting buy-in from the organization to understand that the good old days of 2016, where we collect everything we can and figure out what to do with it later and hold on to it forever, are gone. You cannot do that anymore. Start with your marketing department, by the way, because those guys love that stuff. But really thinking through the flow of where it comes from and how we're managing this and getting serious about it is something that is not optional. We've talked, there are some laws that will almost certainly bubble up here in the U.S. that are going to make it specifically U.S. requirements. For now, we're dealing with GDPR. All GDPR really is, at the end of the day, is a set of best practices of data protection, how to take people's information seriously. There's going to be some version of that coming out in the U.S. and really around the world, I think. And so the sooner that you understand that and get prepared and start taking steps towards changing the way that you're thinking about data and how to protect it within your organization is really the critical first step. And so I'd start with the identification piece and then worry about everything else from there. These projects as well are continuous. They're going to go on over time. You've got this May 25th deadline. That's going to come and go. Nothing's going to happen to you, almost certainly. But the regulation isn't going to go away. The principles aren't going to go away. And so you need to make this a part of decision making as you go through any new project, any new service, any new study, whatever it is. How are we collecting this information? How are we going to manage it? How are we going to secure it? And evolve the program and the compliance strategy over time is something that's no longer an optional piece for any business.
And so, Brian, is there a checklist at this point, or can you not even come up with a checklist until you actually know where all of your data is and where it's coming from and what you're doing with it?
So the checklist is a 35-page, very detailed European regulation. And to be honest, a lot of that is aspirational. It says, here's where we want everybody to get to. Now, if you're 99% of the way there, are you going to get a 4% annual revenue fine? Absolutely not. But if you haven't started, if you're still pretending like it was 3 years ago or 10 years ago in the United States and your policies and procedures match that, you're really going to be in trouble. But I will tell you basically nobody's going to be 100% compliant on May 25th, including Facebook, including Google, just because there's a lot of areas that haven't been settled yet. A lot of gray areas in a lot of these cases. But getting an understanding of what the regulation says and what the principles are, which again are being serious and engaging in best practices about protection of people's information and taking that seriously, heading in that direction is going to get you a lot of the way there.
And so, Kristin, from your perspective, from the life sciences perspective, do you have a short list of what those best practices look like at this point?
I mean, I concur with everything that Brian has laid out. I think that sitting down with your team and identifying all of the data sources and trying to profile those data sources. So I think of it as asset or inventory management, and really sitting back and going, okay, well, we've got a website, we've got this database that has, if you've got databases that have clinical trial investigator information, that's under GDPR. If you've got databases that are so I think you've got to get beyond, we don't have this information out there. You do. I know you do. You might not have ever thought of it as contact information because it's from a professional standpoint and you're just doing clinical research. Just clinical research, right? So it's not even the patient data that I would be concerned about. It's all the operational systems that you put into place to get efficiencies on your monitor management programs. It includes even your management of your own employee data. And I think that's the other thing that we haven't even touched on is if you have European employees that do work on your behalf, or you have European vendors that do work on your behalf, CROs, any kind of manufacturing supply types of things, all of them, any of the databases that you have their information in is GDPR compliant. So you've got to really sit down and go, okay, for my business operations, what are all of the databases that we have and what are all the systems that we use, what information's in there, and how are we going to start to map these kinds of things. And it is going to be an evolution. But I think it's phenomenal what assets are and managing them for the long haul.
So to take a bit of a different spin, absolutely that's where we start. But in terms of, okay, then what do we do once we have this understanding? My approach has been start with those public-facing things. So you're probably going to have to redo your privacy notice. Everything from your online one up to the notices you're attaching to it. Yeah. But those I'll call them collection points or collection scenarios. Every instance that you've identified that information is coming in, zoom way in on that and say, we're going to do this study. And here's the pool. What form do we need to put in front of these people? What kind of consent? What does that language need to say? What do we need to link to? How do we get them to understand and get some kind of a consent to the privacy notice that's going to attach generally, as well as to this specific study? Understanding those collection points and going really deep on a few of those helps you work through a lot of these things, helps you make a lot of these decisions, and also helps sort of the back end of, okay, now we understand how we're going to collect it, we get it in, we're going to structure it from there. But zooming in on those public-facing things that go outside of your organization is key. The other big one is understanding who you are sharing that information with, vendors, partners. There's a lot of data there. It's going a lot of different places, and presuming that you're in the controller role, you are responsible for it once it leaves your organization. That means sending addendums to companies that you currently have agreements with. That means revising your standard services agreement or your standard study agreement to make sure that these get baked into it with new relationships from the start. And then, there needs to be audit provisions in there so you can track it over time. You need to do diligence to make sure that they also have the ability to protect this information and be GDPR compliant on a going forward basis. There's a lot of work that's to be done just in those two phases. So certainly you have to understand what you have to be able to manage it and protect it. But once we get over that phase, understanding those various points where it's coming in and how do we go deep on managing each one of those, I think is a very quick next step.
So, Brian, you've described a lot of steps and obviously a detailed thought process for this. And so we know that big corporations, we'll just call them big corporations, have the resources to implement this and to comply. What are, and actually, Kristin, you too, obviously, what about in terms of innovation? Is this an innovation killer for startups? And what is the cost to comply for smaller companies, if you can put a price tag on that?
I'll just clarify the regulation really quickly. There is no minimum number. There was some discussion as part of the talks of, okay, if you're under this number of employees or this number of people, then you don't have to comply, or there's a different set of rules. That doesn't exist in the final version. And so, technically, if you have one individual's personal data, you are obligated to the full scope of GDPR, which is kind of ridiculous, and I wouldn't expect any enforcement there. But that's where it is. It is black and white. You either are compliant or you are not compliant. You're either within scope or you're not within scope, without regard to the size of the organization. So some of the impact of that's obviously big.
So the stories are already coming out that there are a lot of digital health firms that are shuttering this week. They're saying that they can't comply, the cost to comply is too high, and they haven't figured out their business model yet, and they know that they can't do it. So we are already starting to see businesses shut down voluntarily without any kind of fines or anything like that because of the regs. I do fear, and I think I've expressed this quite a bit, that it is going to hinder our ability to innovate. However, I have been involved with very scrappy startups that as long as you're smart, like from the get-go, you understand the regs, you understand what you need to do to be compliant. I mean, this is even what you have to do with FDA stuff if you're a startup. You still have to have a level of understanding of what's going to be required when I show up at the doorstep of the FDA to get approval of a device or a drug, and I'm a startup. And I got to do it right from the get-go. So this is just one more thing that really smart people in the startup world have to take into account and build towards it. And like Brian says, I do believe, actually we already know, California has a bill that is going to be on the November docket that is GDPR, essentially. And so California is already moving towards more of a GDPR structure, and it'll just be a matter of time before either individual states, I spent too much time over Europe, individual states over here in the U.S. start to do their own privacy and just repeat it over and over again and do variations, or from a federal standpoint, the feds decide we're going to put in a federal level similar to GDPR.
So it's almost a privacy by design approach, I'll kind of call it. So if you're a smaller company, and 98% of your business is U.S. customers and 2% is Europe, can you get rid of them altogether? How do you minimize the data? Do you have to collect everything you're currently collecting about it? Understanding what the regulation says and then truly understanding what you're collecting about those people, and then how do we design around it really becomes a strategy. And it's not without precedent in any industry, but in this one in particular, I'm thinking of like HIPAA. Like if you want to deal with protected health information, you have to be compliant with HIPAA, period. And so if you want to be a startup who services hospital corporations and helps them with records management, this isn't optional. And so getting in line with that, it's just another thing to consider within highly regulated industries that companies in banking and healthcare are already used to. This just basically extends it out to all the marketing, online, software, app companies as well.
So Brian, other than reading the 35 pages or more of the regulation,
Highly
are there resources out there that you can recommend for our audience members to sort through as they work through this process and as Kristin says, get smart?
There is a whole GDPR industry that has cropped up that you have the ability to Google yourself and find all these companies that are willing to help you in a million different ways. Good luck with that. If that's the approach you want to take. One that I rely on a lot is IAPP's resources, so that you mentioned this earlier. The International Association of Privacy Professionals is really sort of the top leading publication on this generally. Fantastic resources there. They have a free email newsletter called the Daily Dashboard. I recommend signing up for it. That keeps you up to date with that. In terms of a very easy to understand, structured version of GDPR that tells you specifically in plain language, this is what this says, and then you can link off to the full text when you want to see that. The UK's Information Commissioner Office, so Google UK ICO GDPR. UK ICO GDPR. They have a really good resource that sort of breaks down the component parts of GDPR, and if you want to learn more about consent, you can zoom in. It says here's generally what it says, and here's the regs that back it up. So that's a good free resource.
But UK has a little variation on their interpretation
plus Brexit,
of GDPR.
et cetera, et cetera.
So you got to be a little careful about the UK reference. Yep. It's good, but it's a different interpretation. So.
And then there's an official site that I've found not to be as good, but yeah, absolutely. Don't rely fully on the UK version for lots of different reasons, but it's a good place to start.
So if we move to enforcement, because we love enforcement, do you have any predictions about what these early enforcement efforts will look like? And I'll throw it out to either one of you. And here's a specific question along with it, just to wrap in, which is, in the event of fines, who's going to be fined? Do we have controllers and processors who are going to be sharing that cost, or how is that going to be assessed?
Yeah, so I think what's going to be interesting is there's another part of this, and I don't think it was in your slides, around civil cases. So the other part of GDPR that's in there is it's not just about the 4% fine that can be used as a penalty by the regulators, but it also opens up the door for class action lawsuits, which over in Europe, they have never really had a formal structure that allowed for those kinds of things. So I don't know if you've ever worked with European regulators over there, but they really don't have massive amounts of regulatory bodies in all these different countries. And so I think that the 4% levy of the fines is going to be like for the big dogs. I think that the civil class action lawsuits is going to be the way that they're going to try to go after the smaller firms, and they're going to be bringing together citizens and say, your privacy was violated, you need to get with everybody over here, and we're all going to go run after Eli Lilly and company because of this, this, and this. And so I think that what we're going to see is the enforcement is not going to be necessarily through the 4% fines. We'll see some of those happen, but I think it's really going to be, I use a phrase, death by 1,000 paper cuts. I think that that's what's going to happen when it comes to us really seeing smaller firms going, holy crap, we really need to do something because we're getting all these cases coming after us, and if we don't fix the problem, it's just going to continue.
Yeah, you're seeing some of that here in the U.S., the way that's playing out. You're absolutely right. I was speaking at a cybersecurity conference in Washington, D.C., I don't know, 6 weeks or so ago, and was talking to UK-based litigators who are already planning to file suits on May 26th against companies they wouldn't tell me who they are. That's going to drive it. The EU regulators have regularly been coming out and saying, before they were saying we don't have any resources, now they're saying we don't have any resources, and oh, by the way, we're not ready for this either. In the U.S., what you see a lot of times is there'll be a private suit, and then later on the FTC will tack on a fine. I think it's really that civil litigation that's going to drive a lot of this. In terms of who's nervous, if I'm Facebook, if I'm Google, if I'm Microsoft, I've been spending 6 years working towards compliance on this. I'm still really nervous on that, day one, what that looks like. I think in my opinion, we'll see what happens here, but I guess my prediction would be that the top level first round of enforcement actions from the regulators is going to be focused on this Cambridge Analytica style behind the scenes, nobody knows what's happening data collection, and really trying to cut some of that off. If you're an organization that is taking this seriously, trying to comply, but you're not yet 100% compliant because you're small, because you don't have a budget yet, because, you're going to be in a lot better position if you're on that path. But if you're some data broker or heavy data intensive company that's collecting all this information and people have no idea what's going on with it, those I think are the ones that are going to be targets really on both sides of the regulation and the civil.
So we still have a couple of questions that we haven't gotten to, but I know that we are at 1 o'clock. So if you didn't get your question answered, please feel free to come up and address it with the panelists. I think both of them can be here for a little while still. And otherwise, good luck. And thank you very much for coming today, for joining us. And thank you to our panelists.
Thanks, guys.